This story contains sensitive content related to infidelity and its aftermath. It is based on a true life experience, though all names and identifying details have been changed to protect the privacy of those involved. Before we begin, please consider subscribing to the channel for more stories like this. My name is Regina Byron, and this is the story of how I shattered my marriage, broke my husband's heart, and ultimately broke my own. It's not a story I'm proud of, but it's one I need to tell. Maybe, just maybe, it can help someone else understand, or at least understand a little better than I did at the time. It started so beautifully. Will, my husband, William Coyle, he was everything I thought I wanted. Kind, funny, adventurous. We met at a small art gallery opening. I was drawn to his easy smile and the way he genuinely listened when I talked about my work. He wasn't intimidated by my ambition, he celebrated it. We fell hard and fast, a whirlwind romance of weekend trips to the coast, late-night talks about our dreams, and a connection that felt electric. Our wedding was perfect, a small ceremony with close friends and family. I remember standing at the altar, looking at Will, and truly believing that this was forever. Those first few years of marriage were blissful. We traveled, explored new restaurants, laughed until our sides hurt. He was my best friend, my lover, my everything. I was so in love, so completely content. Or at least I thought I was. Then things started to shift. Subtly, almost imperceptibly at first. Will got a promotion, a big one, to a leadership position at his company. It should have been a good thing, and I tried to be supportive, genuinely. But something changed in him. He became different, insecure. He started second-guessing himself, questioning his decisions. He'd come home from work drained, not wanting to talk, just wanting to sit in silence. Around the same time, I got promoted too. My career was taking off. I was finally getting recognized for my hard work, and I was making more money than I ever had before. It should have been a shared victory, but it wasn't. Instead of celebrating with me, Will seemed distant, almost resentful. He never explicitly said anything, but I could feel it. This coolness that had settled between us. I tried to talk to him about it, but he'd just brush it off, saying he was tired or stressed. He became less affectionate, less attentive. The little things, the gestures of love and connection, they just disappeared. It felt like he was pulling away from me, and I didn't know how to stop it. One evening, we were at a work function. I was talking to a colleague, Sarah, about a project I was excited about, and I noticed Will watching me from across the room. He had this look on his face, a mix of pride and something else, something darker that I couldn't quite decipher. Later that night, we got into a stupid argument about something trivial. I can't even remember what it was now, but it escalated quickly. He accused me of ignoring him, of being too focused on my career. I accused him of being insecure and unsupportive. We said some hurtful things we both regretted later. The next day, the tension was still thick in the air. He was quiet, withdrawn. I tried to apologize, but he just shrugged me off. Later that week, I ran into someone I hadn't seen in years. Rodney Mendoza, my ex-boyfriend from college. It was at a concert, a chance encounter. I hadn't thought about him in ages, or so I told myself. But seeing him, it stirred something in me, a feeling I couldn't quite place, a longing maybe, for something different. We talked for a few minutes, catching up on our lives. He was charming, funny, just like I remembered. He told me he was living in the city now, working as a consultant. He asked for my number, and I gave it to him. I told myself it was harmless, just catching up with an old friend. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. It was a spark, a flicker of something I thought had died a long time ago. A few days later, I texted him. Just a simple, "Hey, it was great seeing you the other night." He texted back almost immediately. We started talking and it felt easy, comfortable. He listened to me in a way Will hadn't in a long time. He made me laugh. He made me feel seen. I know what you're thinking. I know I messed up, big time. But at the time, it felt like I was drowning, and Rodney was a lifeline. A dangerous, forbidden lifeline, and I foolishly reached for it. The argument with Will kept replaying in my head. His words, his coldness, the way he looked at me, I felt so disconnected from him, so alone. I started to question everything, our relationship, my happiness, my future. I even started to question if I wanted the same things in life that he did. Kids, for example. The thought of having kids with him suddenly felt wrong. One night, after another tense and silent dinner, we argued again. It was the same argument we'd had 100 times before. My career, his insecurities, our lack of communication. But this time, something snapped. I told him I needed space. I needed time to think. He looked hurt, confused. He asked me what I meant, but I couldn't explain it. I didn't even understand it myself. I just knew I needed to get away, to breathe, to figure things out. He agreed to leave. He packed a bag and went to stay at his friend Mark's house. He said he'd give me the space I needed. 2 weeks. He was gone for 2 weeks. 2 weeks that changed everything. 2 weeks that I will regret for the rest of my life. Because during those 2 weeks, I slept with Rodney. 2 weeks. It felt like an eternity, or no time at all. While Will was at Mark's, I was a mess. A whirlwind of emotions. Relief, guilt, confusion. I spent hours just staring at the walls, trying to make sense of what I'd done. I knew I'd crossed a line I never thought I'd cross. But a part of me, a selfish, desperate part, felt liberated. Free from the weight of expectations, the suffocating silence that had settled between Will and me. I saw Rodney again during those 2 weeks. A few times, actually. We talked, we laughed, we connected. In a way I hadn't connected with Will in months, maybe even years. It was exhilarating, dangerous, and utterly wrong. But I couldn't stop myself. It felt like I was caught in a current, being swept away by something stronger than me. When Will came back, I was a nervous wreck. I didn't know what to say to him, how to explain what had happened, how to justify my actions. He seemed hopeful, like he genuinely believed that the 2 weeks apart had somehow magically fixed everything. He was attentive, bringing me flowers, suggesting date nights. He was trying. I could see that, and the guilt, it was crushing me. I tried to reciprocate, to pretend that everything was okay, but it was like wearing a mask. I felt like a fraud. Every time he touched me, I flinched. Every time he looked at me with those hopeful eyes, I wanted to disappear. I knew I had to tell him. I couldn't live with the lie. One evening, we were having dinner. Will was telling me about his day, some work drama, and I just blurted it out, like ripping off a Band-Aid. I slept with Rodney, I said, my voice barely a whisper. The silence that followed was deafening. Will just stared at me, his eyes wide with disbelief. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me like I was a stranger, like he didn't even recognize me. Then the hurt came, a raw, visceral pain that I could see etched on his face. It was like a physical blow. He finally spoke, his voice trembling. You slept with him?" I nodded, tears streaming down my face. "More than once," I whispered, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. He stood up, knocking his chair over. He paced the room, running his hands through his hair. He looked like he was going to explode. "How could you?" he finally said, his voice filled with anger and betrayal. "How could you do this to me?" I tried to explain, to tell him how lost I'd felt, how disconnected we'd become. But the words came out jumbled and incoherent. They sounded like excuses, even to me. He wasn't listening anyway. He was too hurt, too angry. He asked me about Rodney. How long had it been going on? How many times? I told him about the concert, the texts, the everything. I confessed to everything, holding nothing back. The look on his face. It was like I'd shattered something precious, something irreplaceable. He didn't yell, he didn't scream, he just looked at me with this emptiness, this hollow look that made my blood run cold. He said he needed space. He packed another bag and left. This time, it was different. This time, it felt final. I knew I'd messed up beyond repair. I knew I'd broken something that could never be fixed. Will moved out. He found a small apartment downtown. I stayed in the house, surrounded by memories of us, of what we used to be. I spent days just crying, replaying everything in my head, wishing I could go back, wishing I could undo what I'd done. He came over a few times. We talked, or rather he talked. I mostly just listened, numb and filled with regret. He told me how hurt he was, how betrayed he felt. He told me he didn't know if he could ever trust me again. I wanted to tell him I was sorry. I wanted to beg him to forgive me. But the words wouldn't come. I knew sorry wasn't enough. I knew I'd broken something fundamental between us. I tried to be patient, to give him the space he needed. I hoped that with time, he'd come around, that he'd forgive me, that we could somehow rebuild our marriage. But as the weeks turned into months, I started to realize that it wasn't going to happen. The trust was gone. The spark was gone. Everything was gone, except the guilt and the knowledge that I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. Then one day, Will came over. He looked different. Resigned almost. He told me he'd found something on my smartwatch. He didn't tell me what it was, but he didn't need to. I knew it was something that would seal our fate. Something that would concatenate and destroy any chance of reconciliation. Something that would reveal the full extent of my betrayal. And as he looked at me, his eyes filled with a pain I knew I'd inflicted, I knew it was over. I know about the messages, Will said quietly, his voice devoid of its usual warmth. He held up my smartwatch, that sleek little device I'd foolishly believed held my secrets safe. My stomach plummeted. He knew. He knew about the late-night chats with Rodney, the whispered phone calls, the other things. The things I'd tried so hard to bury, to pretend never happened. What messages? I stammered, the lie tasting like poison on my tongue. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and disgust. "Don't insult me, Regina," he said, his voice shaking. "I saw the messages, the ones where you talked about meeting up, about being together. The dam broke. The carefully constructed wall I'd built around myself crumbled." I sank onto the couch, sobs racking my body. "I'm so sorry," I choked out, the words barely audible. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." He sat down beside me, but there was no comfort in his presence. "Didn't mean for it to happen?" he repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. "Regina, you were planning this. You were talking about leaving me, about being with him." "I know," I cried, burying my face in my hands. "I know, and I hate myself for it. I was lost, Will. I felt so alone, so disconnected from you. I said terrible things, I know, but I didn't mean them. Not really." He was silent for a long moment, just staring at the floor. "You said you weren't attracted to me anymore," he finally said, his voice barely a whisper. "You said you were mentally checked out. You said you didn't want to have kids with me." Each word was a dagger to my heart. I was angry, I pleaded. "I was trying to hurt you. I didn't mean any of it." He shook his head. "It doesn't matter," he said, his voice flat. "The words are out there, the damage is done." He stood up and walked to the window, his back to me. "I tried, Regina," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I tried so hard to make you happy. I gave you everything I had. And this is how you repay me?" "I know," I sobbed. "I know I messed up. I want to fix it. I want to be with you. I want to have a family with you." He turned to look at me, his eyes filled with pain. "How can I ever trust you again?" he asked, his voice breaking. "How can I ever believe anything you say?" "I don't know," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "But I'll do anything. I'll go to therapy. I'll cut off all contact with Rodney. I'll prove to you that I love you." He didn't say anything. He just looked at me, his expression unreadable. Then, he turned and walked out of the room. The next few days were a blur. Will moved out of the apartment and back into the house, but it wasn't the same. The atmosphere was thick with tension and mistrust. He barely spoke to me. He slept on the couch. I felt like a ghost in my own home. He started the divorce proceedings. I begged him to reconsider, to give us another chance. But he was adamant. He said he couldn't live with the pain, the betrayal. He said he needed to move on. I refused to sign the papers. I clung to the hope that he would change his mind, that we could somehow salvage our marriage. I wrote him a letter, pouring out my heart. I told him how sorry I was, how much I loved him, how much I regretted everything I'd done. I told him I wanted to have children with him, that I wanted to spend the rest of my life with him. I left the letter on his pillow and waited. I waited for days, agonizing over his response. Finally, he came to me. He held the letter in his hand, his eyes red-rimmed. He told me he'd read it. He told me he believed me. He told me he wanted to try again. I was overjoyed. I threw my arms around him, tears of relief streaming down my face. I promised him I would never hurt him again. I promised him I would be the wife he deserved. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a cautious hope. "I love you, Regina," he said, his voice husky. "But I need you to understand. This is going to be hard. It's going to take time. And I don't know if we can ever truly go back to the way things were." "I know," I whispered, clinging to him. "But I'm willing to try. I'll do whatever it takes." He kissed me then, a long, slow kiss that held both sadness and hope. And in that moment, I believed him. I believed that we could overcome this. I believed that we could rebuild our marriage. I believed that we could find our way back to each other. But deep down, a tiny seed of doubt lingered. A nagging fear that the damage was too deep, that the scars would never truly heal. A year and a half, 18 months, 547 days. That's how long we tried. Tried to rebuild, tried to heal, tried to forget, tried to recapture the magic we once had. But the truth is, you can't unring a bell, you can't erase a memory, and you certainly can't mend a heart that's been shattered into a million pieces. We went to therapy. We had countless conversations, some tearful, some angry, some just empty. I did everything I could think of to show Will I was committed, that I loved him. I cut off all contact with Rodney. I was attentive, affectionate, everything he wanted me to be, or at least everything I thought he wanted me to be. But the truth was, the damage was done. The trust was broken, irrevocably. Every time Will looked at me, I saw the doubt in his eyes. The unspoken question, can I ever really trust you again? He tried to hide it, I know he did, but I could feel it. This distance. This wall that had come up between us. He'd be affectionate one moment, then withdrawn the next. He'd say he loved me, but I could see the hesitation in his eyes. He started comparing himself to Rodney, asking me questions about him, about what we talked about everything. It was like he was trying to piece together some puzzle, a puzzle I'd created, a puzzle that would never have a complete picture. I could see the insecurity eating away at him. He felt like he was second best, like he was always measuring up against someone else. And the worst part was, I couldn't reassure him, because in some small dark corner of my heart, the comparison existed. I tried to reassure him, to tell him that Rodney meant nothing, that he was the one I loved, the one I wanted to be with. But my words felt hollow, even to me. How could he believe me after everything? The guilt was a constant weight on my chest. I felt like I was walking on eggshells, constantly afraid of saying or doing the wrong thing. I was so desperate to make things right, but the harder I tried, the more I felt him slipping away. The passion was gone, the laughter was gone. The easy intimacy we once shared was replaced by a constant, underlying tension. We were living together, but we were no longer a couple. We were just two people sharing a space, bound by a history, but separated by a chasm of broken trust. One night we were lying in bed, the silence between us deafening. Will turned to me, his eyes filled with a sadness I knew all too well. "I can't do this anymore, Regina," he said, his voice barely a whisper. My heart sank. I knew what was coming. "I know," I said, tears welling up in my eyes. "I tried," he said, his voice breaking. "I really did. But I can't. I can't live with this. I can't live with the doubt, the insecurity. I can't live with the feeling that I'm always going to be second place." "I understand," I said, even though I didn't. "Not really. Not completely." He reached for my hand and squeezed it gently. "I still love you, Regina," he said. "But I can't be with you anymore." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. He was right. We couldn't go back. We couldn't pretend that everything was okay. The damage was too deep. The trust was shattered beyond repair. He initiated the divorce again. This time, I didn't fight it. I knew it was the right thing to do. For both of us. The divorce was finalized a few months later. It was a quiet, legal process, devoid of the emotion and drama that had defined our relationship. We divided our belongings, signed the papers, and went our separate ways. 6 months have passed since then. I still think about Will. I still miss him. I miss the man I fell in love with, the man he was before everything fell apart. I think about what could have been, about the future we'll never have. I know he's moved on. I've heard through mutual friends that he's dating someone new, someone who doesn't carry the baggage of our past, someone who can give him the trust and love he deserves. I've tried to move on too. I've focused on my career, on my friends, on myself. But there's a part of me that will always be connected to Will. To the love we shared, to the pain we inflicted on each other. I see him sometimes around town. He looks happy. He looks free. And that's what I have to hold on to. The knowledge that he's finally found peace. Even if it's not with me. I still regret what I did. I regret the pain I caused him, the pain I caused myself. I regret the choices I made. But I can't change the past. All I can do is learn from it. And try to move forward. Try to heal. Try to forgive myself. And try to believe that someday I'll find happiness too. But a part of me knows, a small, sad part, that it will never be the same happiness I once shared with William Coyle. That chapter of my life is closed, and all that's left are the memories. Some beautiful, some painful. All of them indelible. If you found this story resonated with you, if it made you think, or even if it just made you feel something, please consider giving it a thumbs up. It really helps others find stories like this. And if you'd like to hear more stories about relationships, infidelity, and the messy, complicated realities of love, please subscribe to the channel. We share new stories regularly, and we'd love to have you join our community. Finally, if you know someone who might connect with this story, please share it with them. Sometimes, sharing stories is the first step towards healing. Thank you for listening.